Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When I got back from a 3-day forestry conference, the silence on my land was deafening. My trees, 19 of them, rare, beloved, planted by hand, were gone. In their place, stumps, sawdust, and a smug note from the neighbor uphill. He wanted a better view. What he got was war. The silence hit me first. I'd only been gone for 3 days. Portland conference, forestry restoration, some academic talk about seed banks and carbon recapture. But the moment I turned onto my gravel road, something felt wrong. The air didn't sound right. It wasn't the hum of crickets or rustling leaves I'd grown used to. It was too open, hollow, like something essential had been ripped out of the land. I pulled the truck up beside my shed and stepped out. The pine needles underfoot felt the same, but the slope that usually greeted me with a thick curtain of red-barked trunks now looked like a clearing after a wildfire. My heart sank before I even took a step forward. There was a bald patch carved into the hillside, like someone had shaved off a chunk of my home. I dropped everything and walked straight into the breach. My boots crunched over sawdust, fresh, bright, sappy, stumps. A dozen of them, then more. 19 in total, I would later count. And not just any trees. I knew them all by name. The 3 coast redwoods on the ridge, planted with my own hands in 2004 after the fire. The Japanese cedar I'd nursed through drought seasons. The ancient hemlock hybrid I'd cataloged with a research team last spring. Gone. All of them. Cut with clean precision, the kind you'd expect from professional crews, not vandals. The stumps were low, surgical. The trunks, what was left of them, had been neatly stacked beside the trail like a lumberyard display. Whoever did this didn't sneak in with a chainsaw in the night. This was a planned operation, coordinated, permitted perhaps, except no one asked me a goddamn thing. I stood there staring until the birds stopped pretending I wasn't a threat. Then I noticed something odd, plastic glinting near the largest stump, a Ziploc bag pinned under a flat rock. I opened it with trembling hands. A single page. Printed centered text in all caps. Hopefully we can all enjoy the view now. Thanks for understanding, Garrett. That name burned through me like acid. Garrett Voss, new neighbor. Moved in 6 months ago. Big glass and stone house up the slope. Real Silicon Valley retiree energy. Oversized deck, aggressive landscaping. The kind of guy who asked me once if I'd considered modernizing the tree line. I thought he was joking. Apparently not. I took photos. Every stump, every pile, the goddamn note. I launched the drone from my back pocket kit and got full overhead imagery, stitched the GPS data into my property grid. I'd marked every one of those trees years ago. They weren't on the edge. They weren't in a gray zone. They were deep inside my land, some more than 20 feet past the nearest boundary stake. And those stakes, still intact, still flagged. Anyone with a working eye could have seen the line. But maybe that was the point. I checked my trail cams. One had been tampered with, smashed. Another had its SD card removed, but one hidden farther back near the boulder ridge was untouched. When I pulled the footage later that night, I caught a shadow of a truck. Unfamiliar logo, equipment being unloaded, chainsaws humming like locusts. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch with my boots still on, one hand on a cup of black coffee gone cold, the other on a folder already half full of evidence. I wasn't sure yet what to do, but I knew what not to do. I wasn't calling. I was walking up that hill myself. I didn't knock. I didn't even slow down. I marched straight up Garrett's pristine stone steps, past a pair of overpriced ceramic lions, and rapped hard on the glass pane of his oversized front door. The sound echoed through the foyer like a gunshot. I saw movement, shadows behind frosted glass, then a pause, long enough to be deliberate. When the door finally opened, Garrett Voss looked like he'd just stepped out of a weekend catalog. Linen shirt, loafers, smug smile perfectly in place. Behind him, I glimpsed a cluster of people chatting on the patio, holding stemmed glasses, some Bluetooth speaker playing jazz like nothing in the world had gone wrong. "Well, hello there, Trevor," he said, mispronouncing my name like it was French. Back from your forest conference, was it?" "You cut down my trees," I said flatly. He blinked once. Then, as if it were a misunderstanding about trash pickup, he gave a casual shrug. "Ah, you noticed. Listen, I thought it might be a bit jarring at first, but trust me, once the shock wears off, you'll love the view." I stepped closer. "You cut down 19 trees. On my land. He raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Well, that's debatable, isn't it? Property lines up here are creative. And, frankly, those things were a visual blight. You had them packed so tight it was like a damn green curtain. I mean, we live in the mountains. Don't we all deserve to see them? I didn't plant them for your view, I said. I planted them to restore the slope after the fire. You know, conservation, reforestation, habitat support. He waved a hand as if brushing away a mosquito. I'm not against trees, Trevor. I'm just against obstruction. It wasn't just me, you know. Other neighbors have mentioned it. You'd be surprised how many people thought your little jungle patch was aggressive. I laughed once. Short, sharp, bitter. You think this was a community service? I think I improved the neighborhood, he said with a smug sip from a glass that had just been handed to him by some manicured woman in yoga gear. It's not like I built a strip mall. It's landscaping. Besides, most of those trees were on the edge, I repeated. They were 20 feet inside my boundary line. That's your opinion, he said coolly. Let's let the surveyors settle it. I'm happy to fund one myself, if that makes you feel better. I stared at him, a man who could spend tens of thousands on vanity fencing, but couldn't be bothered to ask before committing environmental vandalism. I'm a licensed forest engineer, I said. I know exactly where my lines are. I've got GPS overlays, topographic maps, original plats, and drone records going back 10 years. You want to call a surveyor? Be my guest. Just make sure your lawyer's on speed dial, too. His jaw clenched slightly at that, but the smile held. I'm sure we can settle this like reasonable adults, he said, sipping again. No need to go nuclear over a few trunks. They weren't trunks. They were legacy. You killed them. I turned and walked away. Behind me, someone chuckled at a joke I didn't hear. Jazz filled the silence. I got back in my truck and drove straight to my office, where I unlocked a heavy drawer and pulled out the binder labeled Boundaries in bold red ink. Let him laugh. I was about to draw him a map. The next morning, I was up before the sun. Coffee black, boots on, binder open. I laid everything out across my kitchen table. Parchment plats, laminated survey maps, drone overlays with time-stamped growth zones. My land wasn't just dirt and trees to me. It was measured, documented, archived. I knew every slope, every contour line, every elevation change by heart. There were no ambiguities here, only trespass. By 7, I was on the phone with Emery Quinn, a licensed surveyor from up in Siskiyou County. He'd done contract work with me in the past. Reliable, discreet, and just obsessive enough to take this personally. He agreed to drive down that day. While I waited, I walked the perimeter again, flagging each stump with high visibility tape. I marked the GPS coordinates using my forestry-grade Trimble, cross-referencing the original subdivision deed I'd inherited when I bought the parcel. Each stump landed well within my boundary, some by 15 feet, others by 25. Not a single one sat on the so-called edge Garrett had hand-waved. Emery showed up around noon in his dusty Tacoma with 2 tripods and a face that didn't believe in small talk. We got to work immediately, traversing the slope, hammering stakes, calibrating equipment. The whole process took 3 hours. When we were done, the yellow flag line stood like a crime scene perimeter around the desecrated grove. No gray area, Emery muttered, tapping his screen. These cuts are deep inside your parcel. If you wanted to build a shed here, you wouldn't even need a setback variance. Good, I said. I don't want a shed. I want accountability. We printed the maps on his mobile plotter in the truck bed. High-resolution overlays with coordinates and satellite imagery. Emery signed and notarized them on site. The paper alone felt heavy in my hands, like ammunition. Next, I called Officer Valdez with the county sheriff's office and filed a formal complaint for felony vandalism, unlawful tree removal, and destruction of private property. Valdez sounded reluctant at first. Garrett had apparently already called to flag a potential dispute. But once I emailed the survey documents and photo logs, his tone shifted. This looks pretty cut and dry, he said. We'll open an investigation and send someone out for a statement. I wasn't done. I contacted the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, specifically the Urban and Community Forestry Division. The woman on the phone gasped when I mentioned the hybrid hemlock. Apparently, it was registered in a university study database tied to post-fire resilience species. That opened up a different channel entirely, state-level environmental damage. By sundown, I'd compiled a full dossier, property lines, GPS logs, drone footage, tree species inventory, soil disturbance index, and my original land use plan from 2004. If Garrett wanted a legal fight, I was giving him a war. Just before turning in, I got a text from my neighbor Rob, a quiet retired contractor who lived a few lots down the ridge. It read, "He told us over dinner he was taking care of the trees while you were gone. Said he already hired a crew." Thought he was bluffing, I stared at the message, then at the dark outline of Garrett's glass box up the hill. His lights were still on. His view was unobstructed now. But so was my case. By sunrise the next day, I was already fielding phone calls from agencies that never call this early unless something's on fire or about to be. The county sheriff's office confirmed they'd opened an active investigation into property damage and unauthorized tree removal. Officer Valdez said they'd be sending someone out later in the week to photograph the site and take formal statements. He mentioned Garrett had lawyered up already. Figures. Then came the insurance adjuster. I'd almost forgotten my policy listed those trees as fixed landscape assets under the Forest Regeneration Clause. I'd added the rider myself years ago, knowing damn well how fragile young redwoods could be in this terrain. The woman they sent, Danny Foster, showed up with a clipboard, a laser rangefinder, and the hard stare of someone who'd seen too many false claims to fall for anything. She didn't question the loss. "These aren't ornamental," she muttered, checking the tree tags I'd left nailed to a post. "You grew these, some from seed, some transplanted after the 04 fire." She crouched beside one of the stumps and ran her hand along the smooth cut. "That's a professional job. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were removing." I watched her eyes pause on the laminated planning maps and insurance documents I'd laid out on my tailgate. She took photos, measurements, soil samples. She asked how long the trees had been in place. I showed her dated aerial drone footage from the past 6 years, each frame clearly showing the canopy line well within my boundary. By the end of the visit, she whistled low and said, "This might be the highest payout I've ever recommended for landscape loss." These weren't just trees. These were assets. The word felt clinical, but I wasn't arguing. When her report landed in my inbox later that night, it totaled the damage at $643,000. That didn't even account for what I'd lose on the halted reforestation grant from the state. Another $60,000 I'd likely forfeit now that the project was technically non-compliant. The land's aesthetic had been gutted, its scientific value crippled. The insurance payout might cover replacement, but it wouldn't replace 30 years of growth. Still, it gave me numbers. And numbers talk in court. I filed the civil suit the next morning, claiming damages for destruction of private property, loss of insured botanical assets, and interference with a registered conservation initiative. The clerk raised her eyebrows when she saw the claim amount, but didn't ask questions. I handed over the documentation binder with the weight of a brick, and just like clockwork, Garrett's counterattack came through. A letter delivered via courier, no less, probably to make it look serious. 4 pages of finely printed legalese from a firm in Palo Alto, alleging ambiguous boundary conditions, unmanaged vegetation posing wildfire risk, and an entirely new phrase I hadn't heard before, visual nuisance encroachment. I laughed out, loud when I read that part. According to their claims, my trees posed a credible and sustained threat to neighboring property enjoyment, resale value, and fire safety compliance. They included satellite images with the trees color-circled in red, as if highlighting Soviet missiles. One paragraph even alleged that by allowing such dense growth, I had willfully contributed to localized environmental anxiety among neighboring residents. I wasn't sure whether to punch a wall or frame the letter as abstract comedy. But it got worse. 2 days later, I received an unexpected visit from a county inspector. Clipboard, badge, a tight expression, said he was following up on an anonymous safety complaint regarding fire risk and erosion instability. I led him through the property, showed him the fire breaks I'd installed, the root-holding grasses I'd planted along the slope. He grunted approval, took some notes, and before he left, muttered, "You've been targeted. Happens more than you'd think up here." Garrett wasn't just defending himself, he was going on the offensive, throwing bureaucratic darts and hoping something would stick. He was trying to smear me with enough red tape to stall the investigation, drain my time, and maybe even trigger some kind of county compliance order against me. I wasn't letting it happen. I called my own attorney, Joan McCulloch, a quiet but ruthless woman who'd once taken on the state over improper water rights mapping and won. I sent her everything. The letter, the inspection report, the survey data, the insurance damage sheet, the time-lapse drone footage, even Rob's message about Garrett bragging over dinner. She called me back 3 hours later. "Your case is solid," she said. "But this guy plays dirty. You're going to want to get in front of public opinion before he spins this." "How?" "Media," she said. "Environmental blogs, forestry newsletters, leaks to the right corners of Twitter. I'll handle the court. You remind the world that you're not some grumpy recluse. You're a forest restorer whose work just got chainsawed for someone's Instagram view." It felt surreal, but she was right. By evening, I drafted a statement with Joan's help and sent it to a handful of journalist contacts I knew through the university. One replied almost instantly, interested. The next day, a small headline appeared on a NorCal Eco News blog. "Retired forestry engineer's trees illegally cut for view aesthetics. Damage exceeds $600,000. The photo showed me standing beside the stump of my largest redwood, hand resting on the exposed rings like a tombstone. I didn't smile. I don't know if Garrett expected me to roll over under the weight of paperwork and passive-aggressive threats, but if he did, he'd clearly underestimated the kind of people who spend decades growing trees. We're not quick to plant, and we sure as hell aren't quick to give up. With Joan handling the lawsuit and media interest beginning to trickle in, I shifted focus to building something even harder to dispute than survey stakes: a timeline. If Garrett wanted to play the misunderstood good neighbor card, I'd bury it under a mountain of time-stamped evidence. I started with the drone footage. Over the years, I'd run dozens of automated flyovers to monitor tree growth, soil erosion, and canopy density. My forestry software logged every session, dates, altitudes, geo-coordinates. I built a side-by-side comparison, year over year, showing the redwood's gradual growth inside my boundaries. I annotated the footage, drew overlays, exported stills, and compiled it into a clean timeline PDF that could be absorbed even by a disinterested judge in under 5 minutes. Then I went after something Garrett couldn't fake: tree health. The cut sections of the trunks were still on the slope, untouched since the incident. I sliced samples from the heartwood and wrapped them in canvas, then called in a favor from Dr. Lena Alvarez, a dendrochronologist I'd worked with at the University of Oregon. She'd spent half her life analyzing tree rings for wildfire research and drought patterns. I shipped her the samples overnight with a note that read, "Let me know if these were suicidal." She didn't disappoint. 3 days later, I had a full lab report in my inbox: healthy growth, no sign of disease or root stress, and water retention patterns that showed excellent resilience. The kicker? One of the redwoods had evidence of recent fertilization uptake, a clear sign that I'd been actively managing the health of the grove. I attached that report to my evidence file with a level of grim satisfaction usually reserved for crime novels. Meanwhile, Joan had reached out to the state's Department of Forestry to confirm something I'd suspected. At least 2 of the felled species were on the rare tree watch list maintained for ecological restoration zones. That triggered a new regulatory channel: environmental violations tied to protected species. Even better, it meant that the state might now have standing to intervene directly, or at least submit an amicus brief in our civil case. But the real breakthrough came not from a lab or courtroom, but from a teenager with a cracked iPhone. I was talking to my neighbor Rob again, trying to track down which day exactly the work crew showed up, when his granddaughter chimed in from the porch. "I think I saw that guy on TikTok," she said. "Garrett?" I blinked. "No," she replied. "The tree-cutting guys. I follow this dude who films job sites. He's been posting videos of tree removals all over NorCal. My pulse kicked. I asked for the username. 3 minutes of scrolling later, there it was. A 30-second time-lapse filmed from a helmet cam showing a team of 4 workers systematically clearing trees on a slope. Chainsaws, cranes, wood chippers, the whole deal. At first, it looked like any number of landscape jobs, but in the background, just barely visible, was my deer feeder, the solar panel, the shape of the trail, the fence line. It was my land, my trees. The video was time-stamped. The username was tagged. I reached out immediately. Turns out the guy didn't know the work had been unauthorized. He was just a subcontractor hired by a private firm out of Redding. Paid in cash. No questions asked. He agreed to send me the raw footage after I explained the situation and offered to testify if needed. That video alone was the nail in the coffin. Now I had a geodetic survey confirming the trees were within my property. Drone footage proving the trees had stood for years, healthy and unmoved. A laboratory report verifying their perfect health. Rare species designation from the state's forestry department. And now, independent video footage showing the removal crew in action on my land without permission. Joan's voice practically vibrated with satisfaction when I updated her. "This is a gift-wrapped evidentiary dump truck," she said. "They're going to try to settle." Watch, I didn't care if they did. At this point, I didn't want money. I wanted a verdict. That night, I walked the slope again. The stumps were still there, scarred and raw in the twilight. I took a deep breath and tried to imagine what the hillside looked like just 2 weeks ago. I couldn't. The memory had already been overwritten, but I had everything I needed now. Next stop, court. The courtroom looked exactly like I hoped it wouldn't. Dull carpet, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a judge with the energy of a disappointed librarian. But I wasn't here for theater. I was here for a reckoning. Joan and I sat at the plaintiff's table, her in her signature dark blazer and horn-rimmed glasses, me in the only suit I owned that didn't smell like cedar chips. Across from us, Garrett arrived, flanked by 2 attorneys in matching gray suits and matching gray soles. He didn't look at me as he sat down, maybe because he knew that for the first time in months, this wasn't his terrain. Here, he didn't have a slope to manicure or a brunch table to charm. Here, it was just law, evidence, and facts. The judge, Honorable Miriam Keller, called the session to order and reviewed the agenda. The preliminary motions flew fast. Joan handled them with surgical precision. Motion to admit drone footage, approved. Motion to recognize survey evidence, approved. Motion to exclude Garrett's photoshopped boundary approximations, denied pending review. Then came the opening statements. Garrett's lead counsel rose first, tall and slick, with the kind of voice you expect to hear pitching life insurance over the phone. He began with a careful narrative. Garrett was a community-minded homeowner, concerned for safety, frustrated by unmaintained vegetation, and confused by unclear property lines. He emphasized the fire risk, the erosion potential, and threw in phrases like defensible space and CAL FIRE compliance as if they were incantations. Then Joan stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace. She simply walked to the evidence table, held up a photo of my largest redwood stump, and said, "This tree was planted in 2004 by my client. It stood 23 feet within his recorded boundary. It was healthy, insured, tagged as a restoration specimen, and felled without notice. Multiply that by 18, more silence." She let that sit before launching into the full presentation. First came the drone footage, played on the court monitor year by year, showing the stable tree line, the growth, the consistency of the forest edge. Then the survey maps signed by Emery Quinn, clearly outlining every stump within my boundaries. Then the lab results from Dr. Alvarez. Joan quoted directly, "All specimens were in healthy condition with no sign of root instability, fungal decay, or structural weakness. The trees did not present hazard conditions at the time of felling." Next, the insurance appraisal, $643,000 in losses, including documented impacts on my state-funded restoration project. Then the kicker, the subcontractor video. Joan played the 30-second clip on loop. It showed workers cutting, dragging, stacking, my fence line in the background, my solar trail marker, my slope. Then, in the most glorious cross-examination I've ever witnessed, Joan questioned one of the tree workers who had agreed to testify. He admitted under oath, "We were told by Mr. Voss that he owned both properties. He said he wanted the view opened up for a future pool deck." We didn't check gasps from the small audience bench. The judge raised an eyebrow. Garrett's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. When it was time for Garrett himself to take the stand, he tried to regain control, tried to sound rational, even conciliatory. "I was under the impression those trees were close to the border," he said, "and I acted in the interest of fire safety, both for myself and others." Joan slid a printout across the table. It was the email Garrett had sent to his architect 2 weeks before the cutting. "Trees gotta go. We open up that view. We add 50 grand to resale value overnight." He stared at it like he didn't recognize his own words. The courtroom did. Judge Keller interrupted the exchange. "Mr. Voss," she said, "you hired workers to enter land you did not own. You did so without notifying the property holder, and you removed ecologically significant trees. How exactly did you imagine this would end?" Garrett didn't answer. The judge recessed for the day with a dry announcement that final arguments and verdict would follow next session. We stood. Garrett didn't. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter, just stiller, like the forest was holding its breath. Joan looked over at me and nodded. "We've got this." "But don't celebrate yet." "I'm not celebrating," I said. "I'm mourning the trees." I arrived early the morning of the final hearing, not because I had to, but because I couldn't sit still in the house. I kept pacing the slope where the trees used to be, running my fingers over the stumps like old scars, waiting for some last-minute earthquake to knock the courthouse down. But the sky was clear, the mountain was quiet, and the courthouse still stood, gray, squat, and ready to deliver judgment. Garrett showed up 20 minutes late as if he still believed this was some kind of negotiation. His suit was sharper today, hair combed tighter, but the confidence he once wore like armor had started to crack. He didn't look at me. I wasn't surprised. Final arguments began, and Joan went first. Her voice was calm, not performative, not angry. Just cold, clean fact. She walked the judge through the timeline again, tree by tree, stump by stump. She spoke of root systems, erosion protection, climate mitigation. She emphasized the long-term value of restoration work and what it meant to destroy it for something as empty as a view. Then she switched gears. She brought up the email again, the TikTok video, the subcontractor testimony, the insurance figures, the survey overlays, the health report, the state's rare tree designation. She laid them out like chess pieces in checkmate. And when she ended, she did so with one quiet sentence. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated act of destruction driven by entitlement and executed with complete disregard for property, ecology, and law. Garrett's lawyer took a long pause before responding. Too long. He tried to shift tone, more conciliatory this time. He called Garrett a man who made a poor decision based on unclear circumstances, framed it as miscommunication between neighbors, and leaned hard on the word overreaction. He even invoked community cohesion like it was some sacred church bell. But the judge wasn't buying it. She raised one hand and cut him off. "You've presented no evidence that these trees posed a risk," she said. No official complaint was filed before the cutting. And Mr. Voss never disputed ownership until after legal action began. The room went silent. And then, just before the gavel could fall, Joan stood once more. "Your Honor, permission to submit a late exhibit." The judge nodded. Joan placed a printed screenshot on the court display monitor. It was from a private local Facebook group. A public post by Garrett Voss dated a week before the cutting. Caption, "The view will be wide open soon. Just wait." Not all neighbors understand aesthetics. Underneath, dozens of likes. A few laughing reacts. One comment read, "You finally getting rid of the Bigfoot forest." The judge stared at it for several seconds. Then she turned to Garrett. "You were boasting about this before it happened." Garrett's lawyer didn't object. He just sighed. Verdict was delivered within the hour. Guilty of unlawful destruction of private property. Guilty of ecological interference with protected species. Ordered to pay $643,000 in damages plus $110,000 in legal fees. A state-mandated reforestation order would require him to fund the planting of new trees of the same species under the supervision of the Department of Forestry. Timeline, 90 days. And finally, under a civil mediation clause, he was required to issue a formal public apology to me, published in the local paper and online for no less than 90 consecutive days. Garrett sat there like someone had unplugged him. No outburst. No defense. Just a man who finally realized that charm and money don't bend mountains. Not this one. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. One of them shoved a microphone toward me. I said nothing, just looked up at the hills. That evening, I stood on the slope again. I imagined what it would look like in 10 years. New growth, new rings, the return of shade and soil stability, the deer creeping back in, the quiet. Then I planted the first new sapling myself, a young coast redwood, no taller than my hip. I watered it slowly, placed a small placard at its base. Let the view grow back. The apology came on a Wednesday. A full-page spread in the county paper with Garrett's face looking like someone had photoshopped a soul into him. He stood stiffly next to a generic image of pine trees, arms crossed, expression somewhere between constipation and regret. The headline read, "Local resident issues public apology over unauthorized tree removal incident." The text underneath was worse than a press release. carefully worded nonsense about community values, unintended consequences, and his deep appreciation for the local ecosystem. He even claimed to be exploring opportunities for educational outreach on land stewardship. I nearly choked on my coffee, but the legal team reviewed it and gave me the thumbs up. It met the requirements, 90 days of printed penance, and his online version had to remain pinned to his public social media profiles for the same duration. Apparently, his attempt to post it as an Instagram story didn't count. Joan made sure of that. The replanting began the following week, under the supervision of a state-appointed forestry officer, Brenda, mid-50s. No patience for nonsense and excellent at glaring. Garrett's hired crew showed up in marked trucks, hauling saplings, topsoil, and erosion barriers up the hill. This time, they asked permission to step over the line. I let them, but I watched every movement like a hawk. Brenda had the list: 3 coast redwoods, 6 Japanese cedars, 4 native cypresses, and a new hemlock, grown from clippings of the one Garrett had murdered. Each tree had to be planted in roughly the same spot, monitored quarterly, and receive certified maintenance for 5 years. When one of the workers made a joke about planting trees to fix rich people problems, Brenda shut it down with a single look. I liked her immediately. Garrett didn't show up to the site once. He sent an assistant with a clipboard and a Bluetooth earpiece who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. At one point, he tried to suggest that maybe we could fast-track the reporting and mark the work as completed early. Brenda laughed in his face. By the time the last sapling was in the ground, I stood at the edge of the slope and let the silence return. The mountain didn't feel whole yet, but it had started to stitch itself back together. I used a portion of the settlement money to reinforce my property perimeter, double fencing with buried steel posts. No more misunderstandings. I installed a new row of Sitka spruce along the shared edge, dense and fast-growing. In a few years, they'd be tall enough to block every last square inch of Garrett's panoramic fantasy. And just for good measure, I ordered a custom sign, 3 feet wide, sand-blasted cedar, gold lettering burned into the grain. I installed it at the trailhead beside the new redwoods. It read, "Before you cut, ask, the law remembers." Tourists sometimes take selfies with it now. I don't mind. I still walk the slope every morning. I check on the saplings, adjust the irrigation sensors, chase off the occasional nosy deer. I don't need the forest to come back overnight. I just need it to come back right. A few weeks ago, Rob dropped by with a bottle of something strong and a quiet smile. He asked if I'd seen the real estate listing. "Garrett's moving," I asked. "Looks like it," he said. Listing brags about clear skies and better views. No mention of lawsuits. We drank to irony. I don't know who'll buy that glass box on the hill. I don't really care. But I know this. The next time someone thinks about taking a saw to what isn't theirs, they'll see the new grove. They'll see the sign. And maybe, just maybe, they'll think twice.